because it's an architectural decision. It's a system design decision. You need to add observability, and right now, let's say the flavor of green observability from day one. And you need to start slowly ramping up, right?
Hello, and welcome to Environment Variables, brought to you by the Green Software Foundation. In each episode, we discuss the latest news and events surrounding green software. On our show, you can expect candid conversations with top experts in their field who have a passion for how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of software. I'm your host, Chris Adams.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Week in Green Software, or TWiGS, which is where we break down what matters in sustainable software. I'm Kate Goldenring, and this week we will be diving into the world of software observability and how it can improve the accuracy of our observability pipelines, reduce the noise, and shrink the carbon intensity of our systems. So to join me in this discussion today is Diana Todea. We featured one of her articles about the green side of observability in episode 137. And today we get to dive deeper into the intersection of observability and green software. So on that note, Diana, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Kate. And I'm really happy to be here at your podcast. Yeah, I'm Diana. I'm based in Valencia, Spain, and I'm a DevRel engineer at Victoria Metrics. And I've been working, let's say, in SRE and with observability for the last 5 to 6 years, but overall in technology for like 16 years.
Wonderful. So clearly the perspective we need for today's podcast. And I know it's the end of the week for you, end of a Friday. So excited to dive in. And I know for me, it's pretty hot and sunny here. And I think it is right now for y'all too. So I think everyone's trying to get outside and near a body of water.
Yeah, for sure. Valencia, it's really hot here right now. So I agree.
So let's go ahead and dive into the first topic. I mentioned that we talked about your article, The Green Side of Observability, a few episodes back, but I want to circle back to it because I think it's a great baseline for discussing the issues of observability. So this is an article that you wrote for DevOps.com several weeks ago. And from reading through it, it really highlights that it's really easy to have telemetry bloat. And once you do that, it's really hard to roll back from that. And you even talked through some strategies of how to reduce that specific issue and then other issues around high cardinality of metrics and how you can use retention periods to kind of scope down your impact of your telemetry system. So I'm curious if you could walk through some of the points you made in that article and ways that people can kind of reduce the basically the carbon intensity of their observability systems.
Yeah, absolutely, Kate. Thank you so much for digging into this article. So yeah, the purpose, I think, when I started writing this article was to talk about sustainable and green observability that, to be honest, not many people or many companies are talking about. And I'd rather put a focus than just simply not like having a discussion about cost optimization, but also thinking about minimizing waste, right? So like you very well said, many companies, they're like collecting a lot of data without actually having a strategy or basically doing any system design around observability. And what they do find out, obviously, later down the road is that they keep storing a lot of data. They don't necessarily use any metrics or the full amount of metrics. And what they do is they just have data bloats and obviously a pretty large, pretty high cloud bill at the end. So the point is that working for several years in observability, I really wanted to, let's say, put my finger on the real issue. And I will start basically telling the audience and everyone what can we think about in terms of techniques and what works, and I've seen working with other organizations. So I will start with something that is quite familiar for you, many of you, I hope so, is about reducing high cardinality metrics, because that's one of the biggest wins that any observability team can make. So like I said, many organizations, they will start with the idea that, okay, if we add a lot of detail, then it's good, right? Because then we'll have a lot of data, then we'll get all this telemetry. So in case we have an incident, we will always find the solution there. But this is not a proper way to do it. This is not a very good strategy. Because what we'll have is we'll create the situation of data bloat, Obviously you'll store lots of data, then it will be much harder to process it and also investigate when you reach an incident. So what happens in practice is that you need to start from less is more, right? So we need to start with this strategy. Okay, I'm gonna build up slowly, and I'm gonna have a very stingy strategy, right? So I'm gonna add like important dimensions or important metrics with the mindset that I'm focused on intentional telemetry. So what you're gonna do here, basically, you're gonna get rid of the overhead, and you're gonna be a lot more efficient in terms of operational efficiency. So the same thing applies to retention, right? Because many teams, what they do is they keep the data a lot longer than they actually need. But when they shorten the retention periods or store older data at a lower level of detail, then they discover that they haven't lost anything that important in daily operation, right? So it's just about educating and having a housekeeping exercise and realizing what works for your specific infrastructure and platform teams.
Oh, just to quickly mention for folks who might not be as familiar with the observability terminology, cardinality, maybe you could give an example from, I'll say what my understanding is that with a lot of observability tools, you're able to put tags upon certain metrics that you log or certain traces that you output, and those tags can have higher or lower cardinality. So say that tag could be A or B for some sort of thing, or that tag could be a user ID, and say you have thousands of users in your system, that would lead to a high level of cardinality for that tag that you are ultimately hoping to filter on in the future when you go and look at your some of the metrics that you've gathered.
Yeah, 100%. That's actually it. So basically, the tag or the label, you have like potentially high cardinality labels that will explode in that sense your telemetry. So you have like session ID, user ID, everything that cloud ID, whatever you have there, that basically would add a separate individual tag to all the clients or the tenants, whatever you're trying to use the metrics for, and that just is not sustainable and is not scalable. That's the idea. If you don't want to do that, obviously you still want to keep track, you still want to have visibility, but you need to have a strategy around it, right?
And I think you mentioned reducing the high cardinality, you mentioned reducing retention, and I think you were about to mention potentially a third strategy we can take.
Yeah, exactly. So another strategy, a third one, will be when we aggregate at ingestion level. So, for example, what it means is that if you're interested in only in the overall behavior of a system, then it makes more sense to store a summary than every individual event, right? Because that will reduce the storage requirements, will make fast analysis faster, and you'll preserve the information that you care about. So aggregation and ingestion is actually pretty powerful, and basically will get rid of whatever is unnecessary for your business use case, for your business logic. I have another, like a fourth technique that's actually very used in observability or by observability teams. It's called sampling. Sampling, what it is, because sometimes people kind of miss the point of sampling, because it gets misunderstood, storing data away, right? But it's not that. Good sampling is actually keeping the most valuable data. So instead of storing like every routine or healthy request, then you need to focus on errors. What goes badly, like slow requests, unusual behavior. And here is actually to have not overall visibility, but better visibility. And sampling is actually very used with telemetry, in open telemetry as well, like the project, but I will get deeper into that later on.
I'll just say on the sampling side, my company, we build a multi-tenant serverless platform. So we deal with a lot of telemetry issues because we are tracking per tenant. So we have that user ID cardinality issue. And then we also do a lot of sampling specifically on errors because we use tracing pretty heavily, and traces can be kind of expensive. And so just holding the trace on the error helps us that when our systems are erroring, we can still trace all the way the flow to that error, but we aren't also storing every single successful flow, which could lead to some of that bloat.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a very good technique. And also here on sampling, that's something that came up, and I also wanted to share with the audience because that might be good, and maybe other companies will want to dig into this topic. It's something that came up actually at KubeCon Amsterdam this year in March. Was a talk about the retroactive sampling. And technically, it's pretty interesting because retroactive sampling changes the way you think about the traditional sampling, right? Because normally what you do, you need to decide upfront what you keep and what you discard. And obviously you don't know what you need to keep and what to discard up until after you have an incident and you learn about the context. So retroactive sampling actually changes that, right? You can temporarily retain the data and make those decisions later when you understand the context. And you can preserve the information around the event while reducing the amount of routine activity that gets stored long term. So that's actually pretty cool. I don't want to make it too technical, but I will say that it's a good technical routine. It's a good technical technique, and many companies right now are looking into it. They're trying to implement it, and hopefully once they kind of like let's say fine tune it, they can push it back, right? Donate it to the community, and I mean by that the Open Telemetry community.
Just to check, so what I might have been hearing there, I know you said you don't want to get too much into the technical details, but is it basically you set a smaller retention period for something you might want to retroactively sample? And so you have to make a decision faster than you normally would on whether you want that information. Otherwise, it's thrown away like a normal sampling decision.
Exactly. So basically, once you understand the logic around the event, so you understand, okay, this is an incident that I had, and then you understand like what's important for you around that incident. You keep specific details around that incident, the specific metrics, whatever, but you discard the other stuff that's for you is not important. And then you focus only on that, and then in the future you keep storing exactly what's interesting for you.
Oh, I see. That's very interesting. So basically, you discovered that you wanted to keep something, and then you can tell your system, I now from now on want to keep this because we discovered that we want this. Okay, that's very interesting. And you mentioned this was discussed at KubeCon, is potentially going to be standardized. Maybe in the show notes, we can link a talk or a session about that for people who may be interested in diving a little deeper.
Absolutely. Yeah, spot on. So basically there's, let's say from an observability perspective, there's a lot going on, right? So we have different strategies we can choose from. Obviously, like with time, with technology, we keep getting better at things. But it's important to understand that we need a strategy, like I mentioned. So instead of collecting everything, we need to make sure that we don't fall into the observability paradox, like I call it in my article, which means that we start with a very good intention that we need observability because we need to understand and to have visibility on how our system operate. But if you're not doing it intentionally, then the actual observability platform can become a source of waste. Right. So, and I've seen that many times happening. I used to work as an SRE, and exactly this, you fall basically into the trap where you are logging everything, and then what you have, you just basically at the moment when you reach an incident, you don't know exactly where to move because you have too many of everything. So I would say here is that it's important to focus from day zero on sustainable green observability and have a strategy around it, right? So don't forget, many companies, they add actually observability like at the end of their whole cycle, when they organize or they start the system design or the architecture discussions. But actually they should keep in mind that observability comes first or right from the beginning. And moreover, that we need to have a strategy around the green observability.
And from the green observability perspective, you mentioned how an SRE, they may not be able to decipher the bloat, but also can you maybe discuss some of the dirty sides of this? So how this also might lead to bloat in the amount of infrastructure you have to provision and the amount of storage you need and so on?
Yeah, of course. So basically, like many teams, to be honest, they're not very familiar with observability or they're not very experienced. So unless but because you come from different, let's say, backgrounds, and what happens is that you might think what is important, like metric, logs, traces, and what you have to keep adding things, right? You keep adding things. Managers come and say, "Oh, I need a dashboard that tells me this huge amount of information. I need to pull reports. I need to do this and that. But oh, let's also add observability around this application." And things scale pretty fast, right? And what happens is that as an SRE, I've seen these many companies, they don't really have observability strategy. So they just come and add things as people are asking for it. And you fall into the very same trap where you have an incident in production and basically you don't know what you need to pick. You have too many alerts, you're drowning in the alerting noise, then you're at the end of the month, obviously, the management gets the bill, the computing bill, and then you're kind of like to blame there. It's like, oh, but why do we need so many things? Well, because then then if we have this incident, then it's really hard to debug, right? But in the same time, I've been seeing a lot that SRE teams or infra teams, they're not really sure once they're trying to set an observability strategy. And this basically makes it fall into the trap when you don't have a strategy, you don't have that intentional observability, and basically you're just gonna fall in the pitfall where you shouldn't have been.
Yeah, and on that note, how would you recommend a team ramps up on observability software best practices and avoid some of that bloat through appropriate training? I know for my company, when I was at a startup, we just added observability. We definitely went the route, and then we discovered through our bills that we needed to change what we were doing over time. And it worked fine. Like, we were reactive in a fine way, but I think it would have been nice if there was a proactive rubric we could have followed.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a classical scenario, and I've been there many times. So it's like to start from the beginning with a strategy for observability from day zero. Obviously, have proper training for your engineers, and not only engineers, but also like all the impacted, let's say, teams and managers as well, because it's an architectural decision. It's a system design decision. You need to add observability and right now, let's say, the flavor of green observability from day one. And you need to start slowly ramping up, right? So you need to start slowly ramping up with important metrics. What is important in terms of cardinality for you, for your business logic. Then if you have a specific, let's say, limits on the cost, then you need to specify those, right? Then you need to come up with a strategy around the projects that you're using. Let's say, for example, a project is more important, and you could, let's say, lush around the telemetry that you might want to store, but it won't be the same for other projects, right? So very careful, detailed planning around the projects, the observability for every little thing, and also what you're gonna be doing in terms of alerting, right? How are you gonna be proactive? Do you need synthetic monitoring? Do you need just alerts, which can, be just very reactive? And how are you tackling that? Right now, we are living, for example, in the machine learning era in AI. So machine learning has an interesting function there that's used anomaly detection, which is pretty interesting. Once you add it up in the whole infrastructure workflow, it can be really helpful to be proactive in terms of alerting noise, right? And reduce that alerting noise. So definitely don't leave observability until the end of the story, but add it and have a proper planning, obviously with the help of constant training, and also getting information or more information, updated information from the community.
I think that was interesting that you mentioned kind of some of the machine learning flows that are entering into some of the monitoring systems. I've seen people say and show demos of, you can offload your SREs quite a bit by having some logic put in there. Do you feel like most teams are moving towards that and that's well integrated with tools?
Well, I've seen both. So I've seen the big majority is still not there, right? So companies, they are still using very traditional kind of methods, and they still are pretty reactive to everything, right? But I've seen different companies, depends really on the mentality and, let's say the attitude. they're trying to adopt AI as much as possible, but in a smart way, right? So you're not just like exclude engineers or trying to like replace engineers, but actually being helpful in automation, or trying to use predictive workflows. Basically to gain time, and also to be more proactive. At the moment, anomaly detection, what I was talking about, and AI in general, is not, let's say, is not a standard, right? It's just happening. People are testing it. Companies are testing it. It can have really good or positive impact, but it's not yet standard, right? So we need a lot of experimentation. We need a lot of testing. But I would definitely recommend, and I've seen many companies being interested in that, that they do take the plunge, and they're trying, and they're willing to experiment with it. And we have machine learning, let's be honest, for a lot more than 2 years, so a lot more than ChatGPT came along. So I would definitely recommend to look into that, and maybe start using it.
Yeah, and I think it's a very well-scoped use case where you can use a well-scoped model and get some good insights there as well. So definitely one to explore, and that's been interesting for me. I have another question just about some of the terms they've been using and how those translate to greener telemetry. But there's different categories of telemetry that people collect. So there's traces, there's logs, and there's metrics. And some teams choose to collect all of them. Some teams choose to just collect some of them. And I'm curious, from your perspective, when should you use each? Is there a different impact for each of them? Maybe one's more expensive to store and collect, and maybe one's more expensive to query. And is there a nuance there to explore?
Sure, exactly. That's a very good question. And to be honest, it's good to have a refresher into observability. Yes, there is a difference. So all these that you mentioned are obviously observability signals. Traces, logs, and metrics are, let's say, the classic ones, with profiles coming along in the OpenTelemetry project. Yes, there is a cost to every signal. The cheapest, let's say, what we like to say, is the metrics, right? So it's cheaper to collect, to store, etc. Then we have logs, because you need the timestamp, you need to look specific information around the context. It's way more difficult to analyze it and query it. And then you have traces. That's actually the most expensive one, because you need to store like the whole journey, right, around the application, the service, and what happened there in the background. So to actually come at the beginning and just give like a very brief definition of each. So metrics will be very helpful for us to understand the trends and detect when something has happened or changed. Then logs will provide this detailed context, because you have the timestamp, and you need to you can search exactly when an incident happened or what happened in a very specific, and you have a very verbose explanation around it. And the traces will help us understand like the request or the workflow that moves through the system, and also where the delays or failures occurred. So that's why probably it's the most expensive, because it's a lot more computation around the whole journey, right? And yes, obviously, companies or teams, they're not necessarily storing everything. So what I've seen is that they start with metrics, because obviously is the cheapest one, is the basic one. Everybody needs metrics because you need to understand and you need to create alerts around metrics. And then they move to logs. And maybe if, there is a specific need from the application teams, they move to traces. Because traces, they are specifically correlated with applications, right? With application teams. So, for example, I had companies that I work with, and we never use traces. But right now it's becoming more and more popular. That's why, OpenTelemetry project is very famous and popular, and recently graduated at the moment, because it has become increasingly important to also store and understand traces. And I would say here that it's a good technique is definitely understand your business needs. Definitely understand what is important for you. Obviously, you don't have to store every signal, but it is important to have a correlation between a signal and understand the whole story, right? So if that is the right scenario for you, then observability is perfect, right? The observability as a dynamic system. And anyway, just a side note to that, I also written an article explaining like a bit the evolution of observability signals in terms that they're not just linear signals. You go from this part and then in parallel you have metrics, logs, and traces, but you have a mesh, you have a network of signals, and they tell interconnected stories. So yeah, I hope this is a useful explanation for everybody listening.
For sure. And I think another way that our team uses traces is to understand latency actually of certain executions. Maybe it's not maybe how things were intended to be used, but that can be helpful for us to understand, for us to spin up an individual user on our platform's function. How long does that take? Is that latency increasing? And then you have your metrics for, are we rate limiting someone because they've hit the rate limit? We want to understand that, talk to a customer. And then we have logs for just understanding, okay, our service has started, we know we're going. Things like that is kind of how we've applied those three different types of telemetry. I am curious, we talked about, how you were collecting each of those things and how, it gets more expensive from metrics to logs to traces, just in the amount of data that's being collected. I'm curious, when the other side of observability, you collect it, and then as an engineer, whether SRE, ops, you're going in, you're looking at your data because you're trying to make some decisions or debug what happened. So how much of the cost of observability comes from the querying side of it? And how can we reduce that cost by maybe doing more, just more efficient querying?
Yeah. That's a very, very smart question. And the fact is, yes, it does incur a cost and quite a high one. Because then you have obviously collecting, storing, but querying is also significant. Everybody loves dashboards, right? Everybody wants to look at fancy dashboards, have all this correlation between observability signals, do investigations and complex queries. And you need obviously quite a robust observability platform to handle that, right? The more raw data you store, the more effort will be required to search, aggregate, and analyze it later. So that's why mentioning these, let's say, reducing telemetry techniques is important, because it's not just about storage costs, reducing storage costs, but also it's about improving performance and reducing the cost of analysis. So, for example, I mentioned at the beginning that teams, when they do an analysis, they figure out that they don't use or never query more than 50% of their metrics, which is huge, right? So you end up with storing a lot of things, and then you never query it because you don't need it, right? So what I recommend, and other teams have used it as well, is do a regular pruning of those metrics. Or analyze the queries that take a longer time to execute, right? That you use, for example, a lot of CPU, a lot of memory, or just simply, they're never used. And that goes for, it's very important for infrastructure teams. You can either remove them or just put them, prune them from time to time and figure out, okay, maybe we didn't use that because we never had this use case for a particular application. So you need to properly have a routine. Let's say have a routine in analyzing what happened and what did you use. So analyzing, yes, and looking through the logs, metrics, and traces is a hard task, and you need to do it with intentionality, and you need to have in mind, okay, that right now I need specific features in my observability platform to help me reduce this cost and improve the performance.
You mentioned there a part of pruning that sometimes people don't use half of their metrics. Are there tools out there that can tell you that information? I'd imagine, certain pipelines and toolings basically moves things out of memory. If you haven't looked at it recently, is there anything in progress or that you could imagine a tool being created that could basically report to you, hey, you haven't queried this metric, maybe you should get rid of it? I think of how Slack will say, hey, you haven't used this channel in a while, maybe you want to leave it.
Yeah, of course, definitely. I mean, there are like open source projects that do that. There are specific tools within, for example, Mimir, which is an open source project that tells you exactly in your dashboards like what metrics are you using or not using. You have like another open source project, Victoria Metrics, that specifically has in its user interface cardinality explorer features and exactly what I was mentioning, like being able to look at the queries that take longer to execute or consume CPU or memory. And I'm pretty sure there are others, and there are like right now with the help of AI, you can actually do AI agents workflows that could be very specific to the observability platform that you are using. But yeah, I mean, I always recommend something open source, and then obviously you can build upon that and tailor it according to your observability platform and your business logic.
Great. You said Mimir was one of them. I want to make sure we put that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, Mimir, yes, exactly. Grafana Mimir open source, yeah.
And you mentioned sometimes you can see that a query can take a long time. And Victoria Metrics, for example, you can see the amount of time in VMUI it took to query something. I'm curious, there's one specific scenario that my company, we've debated back and forth a little on because you could either collect a metrics differently or you could query it to get the same result. And the specific example is we were trying to track how long it takes for an application to deploy through our system. And we had this debate of should we be tracking timestamps or durations for each hop in our system? And I'm curious what your thought is on, collecting a timestamp and retroactively calculating a duration versus calculating a duration in your services and publishing that as a metric and, similar kind of trade-off questions that one may come to when they're deciding what type of a metric to emit.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, it's also important because it allows you to have some flexibility, right? That timestamps are pretty important because it will give you flexibility and you can reconstruct different stages of a workflow later. And the idea here is like it's obviously it works. It depends obviously on your workflow, your business logic, but you can also try to keep the timestamps in the traces. And then with your, like, for example, your engineering teams can investigate and reconstruct the workflow when needed. And also you can try exposing key duration metrics that operators and SRE teams use regularly. And also what we have been discussing so far about the retroactive sampling, right? So exactly, you don't need to decide upfront what data you need to keep or discard. But then you just analyze the incident that happens, and then you retain the flexibility initially and make the decisions later, right? But yeah, it depends, right? So you can use retroactive sampling, you could use like aggregation at ingestion, or different other techniques that we discussed previously.
That makes sense. So yeah, I think what I'm hearing is, timestamps give you a little bit more precision, but you don't have to be right on the first time because you can always retroactively sample if you get on board with that new feature that's coming to OpenTelemetry soon. That makes sense. I also noticed I was looking at some of your posts that you had on LinkedIn, which is great if anyone wants to follow some of the updates on observability and the intersection with green software. I noticed I actually wasn't aware that there's an SCI for OpenTelemetry that's under development, and I noticed that you reposted that. How familiar are you with that project that's underway, and are you interested in getting involved with it and kind of its mission there? And for those who might not be familiar, SCI stands for software carbon intensity, and it's a formula for calculating how much carbon a specific action of your software does. And it's a formula that was created by the Green Software Foundation, and it's pretty generic, and a bunch of different areas of tech are creating specific implementations of it or specific specifications of it. So you have SCI for AI, that's an ISO standard now, SCI for the web, which is on its way to becoming an ISO standard, and now SCI for OpenTelemetry is there's a working group gathering around that. So curious to hear your thoughts on that, Diana.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I really like that you brought this up because I gave a talk about green observability in March earlier this year, actually at Scale 23 conference. And one of my additions there in the talk was, why are we not focusing SEI in observability? Because there's SEI for software, right? It's basically measures, right, the carbon intensity for software, but there's nothing like really implemented or focused on observability. So I actually, one of my notes there, and the takeaway is like, I would really like to see this applied to observability. And when like a couple of weeks ago, I saw that Green Software Foundation just created this new application for SEI for Open Telemetry, which is really, really great. I did apply. So you can apply, everybody can apply. And basically the communities, both communities can work on it. So that means like we need to create a semantic conventions framework and create the vocabulary around what it means exactly for Open Telemetry. It won't be easy because, Open Telemetry is recently graduated, but is definitely, I think it's so important in terms of the whole framework of green observability. So I'm really happy that, how can I say, like my original thought coincided with the Green Software Foundation, workflow. And it's really great. It needs obviously a lot of tuning. We need to understand a lot of, let's say, what the concepts really mean, how to apply them, what other projects we need to look for, because we have, for example, other CNCF projects that focus on, let's say, carbon efficiency, like Kepler, and others maybe right now that are taking off, like other open source projects that are taking off. And it needs a village, right? Community works best when we coincide, when we sit together, when we communicate, and we try to reach a consensus, a standard. So I think this is an important initiative at this moment. And definitely I would recommend everyone who is interested in observability, open telemetry, green observability, and sustainability to apply for it, and use your experience to actually help the community with it.
Yeah, I think the big hard part with SEI is choosing the functional unit. What is the unit you're going to measure? And I think for observability, it'll be interesting because I think there's the collection pipeline and there's the analysis pipeline. So there's two different, there's the in and two different lenses you'll have to look at it from. So it'll be interesting to follow along with that and see how that makes its way. And I guess I'm curious, when you started thinking about the green side of observability, do you think there is usually with green software a pretty clear correlation between cost savings and being greener with your stack? Do you think that correlation always exists with observability and making observability greener? Or do you think there are times when a team has to choose green observability even when it doesn't save them money?
Yeah, I understand. It's pretty interesting, the angle around it. I would say obviously it's you need to understand a bit like the business logic and what actually are you trying to do inside your own company, right? But taking into consideration that you have some rules, or you have, let's say, like a global framework around the green or the sustainability. It might not work in all the cases, right? You might say no to green observability, or might say like, okay, this is really, really difficult to implement both or to keep with the rules. But this is where, let's say, the human curiosity or the engineering part comes into play, right? So I would say to definitely make it a priority, right? Because if it always appears, let's say, in your daily meetings or in your planning, in a company strategy, then definitely with this in mind, you can plan better, right? You can architect around it. It won't work from the beginning. You have to do probably a lot of changes. But just hearing from other companies how they tried different things, little by little, there's always going to be improvement. It's not going to be on day one, but definitely along the way, we will find methods, because this is what we do, to also be green. The important thing is to actually keep it as a priority and add it there on the list of your architectural strategy.
100%. I think that's been kind of the theme of our conversation today is be proactive about this, make it a priority, understand your options. Are there any other takeaways you would give some of our listeners about green observability?
Yeah, I would say just start simple. I think this is the theme of today's episode. The important thing is actually ideas will always come along. There are always open source projects that sprung to life. So keep a lookout on those. Try to invest on those. Have more engineers actually onboarded and trained with this idea in mind. And basically, this is where the beautiful thing happens, Then we'll get more and more people invested, motivated, and along the way, obviously, will become a standard for sure.
Well, thank you for just being such a wealth of knowledge on this topic. And I certainly have some more takeaways the next time I have to build out a system and some information I'm going to bring back to my team. So I really appreciate it, Diana. And that's all of our content for today. So I'm just going to run through some events. We usually end each of our episodes with plugging people into maybe some community green software events near them. So I'm going to name a few that are coming up. Sustainable Tech in the Age of AI is coming up on June 29th in Hamburg at 6 p.m. And through that event, you can explore practical approaches, including responsible design, efficient software engineering, and a more conscious AI use. Another event happening in BST time is the UK. There's a UKSG seminar minimizing the environmental harm of AI through principle thinking. And that's going to be a discussion around AI's environmental footprint and how that's been explored in research and publishing. And then finally, there is in Frankfurt, a event on reducing cost and carbon. So you can learn how targeted code optimizations can minimize cost and carbon emissions, all with practical examples. And that's on July 2nd. So some fun events coming up. And as a reminder, all of the topics and events that we've talked about today will be sure to link in the show notes. And you can visit podcast.greensoftware.foundation to listen to even more episodes of Environment Variables and hear from even more guests that will be coming your way in the next few episodes. So that's it for this week's The Week in Green Software. A huge thank you to you, Diana, for joining our conversation. I really appreciated all your time. And with that, we'll see you all the next episode.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Environment Variables on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people discover the show. And of course, we'd love to have more listeners. To find out more about the Green Software Foundation, please visit greensoftware.foundation. That's greensoftware.foundation in any browser. Thanks again and see you in the next episode.